The Mossad deep cover operation. The Cohen infiltration. The transmission came through at 2:47 a.m. Damascus time, and the encryption was holding for exactly 90 seconds before the Syrian counterintelligence sweep would cycle back to this frequency. The message contained coordinates, a date, and 3 words that changed everything. They know something. Eli Cohen pressed the transmit button on the custom-built radio concealed inside the ornate wooden chest in his study, sending the final burst of intelligence data about Syrian tank deployments on the Golan Heights. His hand was steady, the radio powered down. 30 feet away, in the street below his luxury apartment in the Al-Malki district, 2 unmarked sedans had just parked with their engines running. Cohen had exactly 4 minutes before the neighborhood security detail would complete their scheduled rotation, and he had to decide. Destroy the radio and eliminate the evidence, or preserve it for one more critical transmission scheduled for tomorrow, when the defense minister would be visiting his home. The needle on the detection meter built into his watch ticked into the amber zone. Radio frequency scanners were active within 200 meters. He looked at the radio. He looked at the window. The cars hadn't moved. This was either a standard patrol or the beginning of his capture. Everything he had built over 3 years, every relationship, every piece of intelligence, every risk taken, came down to this moment. And the decision he made in the next 60 seconds would determine whether the operation that had penetrated deeper into an enemy government than any intelligence mission in modern history would end in triumph or catastrophe. 3 years earlier, in a nondescript office building in Tel Aviv, the leadership of Mossad faced a strategic intelligence void that threatened Israel's national security. The year was 1960, and Syria had just emerged from a merger with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic, a union that placed Israeli forces within striking distance of a unified Arab military command. The problem was simple and terrifying. Israel had virtually no human intelligence assets inside Syria's military or governmental structure. Signals intelligence could intercept communications, but it couldn't reveal intentions. Satellite technology was still primitive. The Golan Heights, a volcanic plateau rising above northern Israel, was being systematically fortified by Syrian forces, and Israeli intelligence analysts were working with incomplete data about troop strength, artillery positions, and strategic planning. The previous year, 3 separate attempts to insert undercover agents into Syria had failed. 2 agents were captured within weeks and executed. 1 simply disappeared. The Syrian Mukhabarat, the intelligence service, had become sophisticated, paranoid, and effective. Traditional infiltration methods were failing. The director of Mossad, Isser Harel, convened a special task force with a single mandate: develop a penetration operation that could reach the highest levels of the Syrian government and military and make it sustainable for years, not months. The task force included Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel, and a collection of the agency's most experienced case officers. They analyzed the failures. The pattern was clear. Agents were being caught because they were entering Syria as outsiders trying to blend in, and the Mukhabarat was efficient at identifying anomalies. The task force needed a different approach, and the solution they developed was radical. Create an agent who didn't infiltrate Syria, but who returned to Syria as a native son who had made his fortune abroad and wanted to come home. Eliyahu ben Shaul Cohen was not Mossad's first choice, and that fact would prove to be irrelevant because he became the only choice who could execute the plan. Cohen was born in 1924 in Alexandria, Egypt, to a Syrian Jewish family. His parents had emigrated from Aleppo, and he grew up speaking Arabic with a flawless Syrian accent, the kind that couldn't be taught or faked. He understood the culture, the social codes, the religious nuances, and the family structures of Syrian society because they were embedded in his identity. In 1956, after the Suez Crisis, Egypt began expelling its Jewish population, and Cohen immigrated to Israel. He was 32 years old, married, and working as an accountant. He had no formal intelligence training. What he did have was a profile that Mossad's operational planners recognized as rare and irreplaceable: authentic Syrian heritage, native linguistic ability, and a personal history that could be reconstructed to fit the exact legend they needed to create. Mossad approached him in 1960. The recruitment pitch was direct. Israel needed an agent who could become someone else for years, live under constant threat of exposure and execution, and gather intelligence that could save thousands of Israeli lives in a future conflict that strategic analysts believed was inevitable. Cohen didn't answer immediately. He went home. He talked to his wife, Nadia. He considered what the mission would cost. Years away from his family, living a lie so deep that he would have to sever all normal contact with his previous life, and the near certainty that if the operation failed, he would be tortured and killed. He accepted the mission 48 hours later. The preparation phase began in January 1961 and lasted 14 months, a duration that reflected the operation's complexity and Mossad's understanding that shortcuts would lead to exposure. Cohen's training was not the physical and tactical curriculum of a field agent. It was an intensive program designed to reconstruct his identity at a psychological and cultural level. The legend they built was this: Kamal Amin Tabes, a Syrian emigrant who had left Damascus for Argentina in the early 1950s, established a successful import-export business in Buenos Aires, accumulated wealth, and now wished to return to his homeland as a patriotic Syrian, ready to contribute to the nation's growth. The cover story had to be verifiable through multiple layers because Syrian intelligence would check. Mossad operatives traveled to Argentina and created a paper trail. They established business records, opened bank accounts, rented an apartment in Buenos Aires under the Tabes name, and built relationships with local Syrian expatriate communities. They fabricated correspondence. They planted Tabes' name in social clubs and business directories. When Syrian investigators eventually checked, and they would check, the evidence would confirm that Kamal Amin Tabes was a real person who had really lived in Argentina. Cohen memorized every detail of this fabricated life. He studied Argentine geography, business practices, and culture. He learned the names of streets in Buenos Aires, popular restaurants, and political events from the previous decade. Trainers would wake him at random hours and interrogate him, trying to catch inconsistencies. They role-played social situations. They tested his ability to maintain the legend under stress, alcohol, and fatigue. Simultaneously, Cohen underwent a different kind of training, the operational skills of a spy. He learned dead-drop techniques, surveillance detection, covert communication methods, radio operation, encryption, and photography. He studied Syrian military structure, political factions, key personalities in government, and the tribal and religious dynamics that influenced power in Damascus. The training was relentless, and the instructors identified a quality in Cohen that became central to the operation's success. He was a natural social operator, charming, curious, and capable of making people like him and trust him quickly. In February 1962, Eli Cohen ceased to exist in any official capacity, and Kamal Amin Tabes came into being. The operation's first phase required establishing the legend on neutral ground before entering Syria. Cohen traveled to Argentina, not directly from Israel, but through a series of connecting flights designed to obscure his origin. He arrived in Buenos Aires and spent 3 months living as Taabes, activating the cover identity. He frequented the Syrian expatriate social clubs that Mossad had already seeded with information about his arrival. He was introduced as a successful businessman who had returned to reconnect with his roots. He donated money to Syrian cultural organizations. He hosted parties. He spoke passionately about his love for Syria and his frustration at being so far from his homeland. The expatriate community embraced him. Among the Syrians in Buenos Aires were individuals with connections to the government in Damascus, and this was not a coincidence. Mossad had mapped the social network and identified that certain club members had relatives in positions of influence. Cohen cultivated these relationships carefully, never appearing too eager, always allowing others to suggest that a man of his talents and wealth should consider moving back to Syria to help the nation. The social engineering was meticulous. By May 1962, Cohen had received informal invitations from 2 separate expatriates to contact their relatives in Damascus if he ever decided to return. One of these contacts was connected to the Syrian military. The other had ties to the Ba'ath Party, which was rapidly gaining political power. Cohen's handlers in Mossad monitored his progress through coded letters and a single brief personal meeting with a case officer who traveled to Buenos Aires under separate cover. The assessment was positive. The legend was holding, and Cohen was ready for insertion. Cohen arrived in Damascus in January 1962, entering Syria with an Argentine passport under the name Kamil Amin Tabes. The passport was genuine, issued by corrupt officials in Buenos Aires who Mossad had paid. Syrian customs officials checked his documents, asked routine questions about the purpose of his visit, and allowed him entry. The first days were the most dangerous. Syrian intelligence maintained files on returning immigrants, especially those with wealth, because they were potential intelligence threats or targets for recruitment. Cohen behaved exactly as his legend dictated. He checked into a high-end hotel, he contacted the relatives of his Buenos Aires acquaintances, and he began exploring business opportunities, presenting himself as an investor, evaluating where to allocate capital. Within 2 weeks, he moved from the hotel into a rented apartment in the Al-Malki district, an affluent neighborhood where government officials, military officers, and foreign diplomats lived. The location was strategic. Proximity to power was essential for the mission, and the Al-Malki district offered social access that other neighborhoods couldn't provide. Cohen furnished the apartment expensively, projecting the image of a wealthy man who appreciated luxury and was willing to spend money on social entertaining. He hosted gatherings, serving premium whiskey and imported foods, creating an atmosphere where guests felt special and valued. The guest list began modestly. Business contacts, acquaintances from the expatriate network, and their friends. Cohen was charismatic and generous, always interested in others, asking questions, listening carefully, and making people feel important. The social strategy was deliberate. In Middle Eastern culture, hospitality and generosity create bonds of obligation and friendship, and Cohen was leveraging these cultural codes to build a network. The intelligence collection began slowly, cautiously, and indirectly. Cohen's initial reports to Mossad, transmitted through coded letters sent via Europe, contained basic observational data. The mood in Damascus, economic conditions, political gossip, and the names of individuals in his expanding social circle. He wasn't pushing for classified information. He was establishing himself as a fixture in the social landscape, someone whose presence was normal and expected. The communication method was low-tech and slow. Letters written in invisible ink mailed to cover addresses in Europe, where Mossad operatives would retrieve and process them. This method was secure but frustrating for handlers who wanted real-time intelligence. Cohen couldn't risk using a radio transmitter in the early phase because the act of acquiring radio equipment would raise suspicion, and Syrian counterintelligence was known to conduct random sweeps for illegal transmissions. The waiting period was essential. Trust had to be built, and shortcuts would trigger the paranoia that permeated Syrian intelligence culture. 3 months into the operation, Cohen achieved the first significant milestone. He was introduced to a mid-level officer in the Syrian army through a mutual friend. The officer, whose name was never recorded in declassified files, but who served in a logistics role, became a regular attendee at Cohen's social gatherings. The relationship developed naturally. Cohen never asked direct questions about military matters. Instead, he created an environment where the officer felt comfortable talking, and people talk when they drink, when they're relaxed, and when they're with someone who seems genuinely interested in their lives and challenges. The officer mentioned, in passing, that the army was expanding its fortifications on the Golan Heights and that supply chain issues were causing delays. This was actionable intelligence. Cohen included it in his next communication to Mossad, carefully worded and embedded within other information to avoid highlighting its importance in case the letter was intercepted. By mid-1962, 6 months into the Damascus operation, Cohen's social network had expanded to include multiple military officers, businessmen with government contracts, and members of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party was crucial. It was a nationalist, socialist political movement that advocated for Arab unity and was gaining traction within Syria's political and military structures. Cohen recognized, and his Mossad handlers confirmed through external analysis, that the Ba'ath Party was likely to seize power in the near future, and relationships with its members would become invaluable. He cultivated these relationships with the same patient strategy: generosity, hospitality, and the projection of being a successful, worldly Syrian who had returned to contribute to his nation's future. One of the key figures Cohen befriended was Amin al-Hafiz, a military officer and Ba'ath Party member who would later become president of Syria. The relationship began at a social gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance. Cohen and al-Hafiz talked about politics, Syrian nationalism, and the future of the Arab world. Cohen presented himself as a passionate supporter of Arab unity and Syrian strength, views that aligned perfectly with Ba'ath ideology. Al-Hafiz was impressed by Cohen's worldly experience and his financial success, and he saw in Cohen a valuable supporter and potential source of funding for the party. They met again at subsequent gatherings. Cohen was careful to never appear sycophantic. He engaged al-Hafiz as an equal, offering opinions and asking thoughtful questions. The friendship deepened. This relationship, more than any other, would eventually provide Cohen with access to the highest levels of Syrian strategic planning. The operational tempo increased in late 1962, when Mossad authorized Cohen to acquire and operate a radio transmitter, a decision that reflected both the value of the intelligence he was gathering and the calculated risk that his cover was now strong enough to support more aggressive collection methods. The radio transmitter was not something Cohen could simply purchase in Damascus. Its acquisition required a complex smuggling operation. Mossad technical officers custom-built a transmitter that was compact, powerful enough to reach a listening post in Israel, and designed to be concealed within ordinary furniture. The device was broken down into components and smuggled into Syria through multiple routes over the course of 2 months. One component arrived hidden inside a shipment of imported goods consigned to a front company. Another was carried across the border by a courier who posed as a traveling salesman. The final piece, the encryption module, was hand-delivered by a Mossad operative who entered Syria on a forged passport. Met Cohen in a crowded market under the guise of a chance encounter, and passed the module in a brief, practiced exchange that lasted less than 10 seconds. Cohen assembled the transmitter in his apartment, concealing it inside a custom-built wooden chest that appeared to be an ornamental piece of furniture. The chest was designed with a false bottom, accessible through a hidden latch. The transmitter itself was a marvel of miniaturization for its era. A vacuum tube design that could broadcast on multiple frequencies, with an encryption system based on one-time pads that made the transmissions theoretically unbreakable if the pad was never reused. Mossad provided Cohen with a schedule of transmission windows, specific times when Israeli listening posts would be monitoring the designated frequencies. The transmissions were brief, typically less than 90 seconds, to minimize the risk of detection by Syrian direction-finding equipment. Cohen's first radio transmission occurred on a January night in 1963, and the content was explosive. Detailed information about Syrian plans to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River, a project that would have crippled Israel's water supply. The intelligence included the locations of proposed diversion sites, timelines, and the engineers contracted for the project. This intelligence reached Israeli military planners within hours, allowing them to begin formulating counter-strategies. The value of having a real-time communication channel transformed the operation. Instead of waiting weeks for letters to arrive, Cohen could now transmit urgent intelligence immediately. The transmission schedule became routine. 2 or 3 times per week, always late at night, always brief, and always encrypted. Mossad analysts in Tel Aviv began receiving a stream of intelligence that provided unprecedented insight into Syrian military capabilities and strategic intentions. Cohen reported on troop movements, weapons shipments from the Soviet Union, internal political conflicts within the Syrian government, and the identities of key decision-makers. Each piece of intelligence was cross-referenced with other sources, and the correlation was consistently high, which meant Cohen's information was accurate. The operation was working, and it was exceeding all initial expectations. The social engineering reached a new level in 1963, when the Ba'ath Party executed a successful coup and seized control of the Syrian government. Amin al-Hafiz, Cohen's friend and frequent guest, became a central figure in the new regime, eventually rising to the position of president. This was an intelligence windfall that Mossad's operational planners could not have predicted with certainty, although they had assessed that cultivating Ba'ath Party relationships was a high-probability strategy. Cohen's relationship with al-Hafiz provided him with access that transcended mere social connection. He became a trusted advisor, a sounding board for ideas, and a symbol of the successful Syrian expatriate who had returned to support the nation. Al-Hafiz invited Cohen to official functions. He introduced him to other senior officials and military commanders. Cohen attended meetings where national security issues were discussed, not because he held an official position, but because he was a friend whom al-Hafiz valued and trusted. The cultural context is important. In Middle Eastern political culture, personal relationships and trust networks often supersede formal institutional structures, and a trusted friend can have access and influence that far exceeds their official title. Cohen exploited this dynamic masterfully. He never asked direct questions about classified matters in these settings. Instead, he listened, remembered, and occasionally offered opinions that demonstrated his intelligence and reinforced his value as an advisor. The information flowed to him because people trusted him, and because he had created an environment where sharing information felt natural and safe. During this period, Cohen's double life required extraordinary psychological discipline. In Damascus, He was Kamel Amin Tabes, a wealthy, sociable, patriotic Syrian who loved his country and supported its leadership. In the privacy of his apartment late at night, he was Eli Cohen, an Israeli intelligence officer transmitting secrets that could lead to the deaths of the very people who called him friend. The cognitive dissonance was immense. Cohen managed it by compartmentalizing, a psychological technique where conflicting identities and moral realities are kept in separate mental spaces to prevent paralysis. His handlers in Mossad were aware of the psychological toll. Standard procedure for deep cover operatives included protocols for monitoring mental health, but the covert nature of the operation made regular psychological check-ins impossible. Cohen's only direct contact with his handlers occurred during brief trips outside Syria, ostensibly for business purposes. On 3 occasions between 1962 and 1964, he traveled to Europe, where he met with Mossad case officers in secure locations. These meetings served multiple purposes: debriefing, operational planning, psychological assessment, and the rare opportunity for Cohen to step out of his cover identity and speak freely. During one of these meetings in Paris, a case officer noted in a classified report that Cohen was holding up well under the stress, but showed signs of isolation fatigue, a common condition for long-term deep cover operatives who are cut off from their real identities and support networks. The case officer recommended shortening the operational deployment, but headquarters overruled the recommendation because the intelligence product was too valuable, and there was no replacement asset capable of achieving the same level of access. The intelligence Cohen provided between 1963 and 1965 was not limited to strategic policy. It included granular tactical information that would prove decisive in future military engagements. One of the most significant intelligence coups involved the Syrian fortifications on the Golan Heights. The Golan is a basaltic plateau that rises steeply from the Sea of Galilee and provides a natural high ground advantage over northern Israel. Syria had been fortifying the Golan since the 1950s, constructing bunkers, artillery positions, and trench systems designed to withstand assault and provide fire superiority over Israeli settlements below. Israeli military planners knew the fortifications existed, but lacked detailed knowledge of their locations, specifications, and vulnerabilities. Cohen gained access to this information through his relationship with senior military officers who were involved in the fortification projects. On one occasion, a general invited Cohen to tour the Golan Heights fortifications, an invitation extended as a gesture of friendship and trust. The general was proud of the defensive systems being built and wanted to show them to a patriotic Syrian who would appreciate the strategic value. Cohen accepted the invitation. During the tour, he observed bunker locations, artillery placements, communication trenches, and supply routes. He asked questions that seemed natural for a civilian interested in his nation's defense. How deep were the bunkers? What type of artillery was being installed? How were supplies transported to forward positions? The general, flattered by the interest and seeing no security risk in sharing information with a trusted friend, answered in detail. Cohen memorized everything. That night, back in Damascus, he transmitted a comprehensive report to Mossad, including coordinates, bunker specifications, fields of fire, and observed weaknesses in the defensive layout. This intelligence was integrated into Israeli military planning and would be directly used in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when Israeli forces assaulted and captured the Golan Heights. The fortifications that Cohen had mapped were targeted and neutralized with precision, and Israeli officers later stated that the intelligence was critical to the success and reduced casualties of the operation. Cohen's operational security practices were meticulous, but they were not perfect. and the accumulation of small risks over time increased the probability of detection. Syrian counterintelligence was actively searching for Israeli spies, a fact that Cohen and his handlers were acutely aware of. The Mukhabarat employed multiple detection methods: signal intelligence to identify unauthorized radio transmissions, surveillance of suspicious individuals, informant networks, and random security sweeps in sensitive neighborhoods. Cohen took extensive precautions. He varied his transmission times and frequencies according to a schedule coordinated with Mossad. He built the radio into furniture that could be disassembled and hidden quickly if necessary. He used a portable antenna that he deployed only during transmissions and then immediately retracted and concealed. He never transmitted from the same location in his apartment twice in a row. He maintained his social profile carefully, ensuring that his behavior remained consistent with his cover identity. However, every transmission was a risk. Radio direction finding technology, even in the 1960s, was capable of triangulating the source of a transmission if given enough time and multiple signals to analyze. Syrian counterintelligence had acquired Soviet-made direction-finding equipment, and they were actively monitoring the airwaves for anomalous signals. Mossad technical officers had designed Cohen's transmitter to use burst transmission techniques, where the data was compressed and sent in very short, high-speed bursts to minimize the window for detection. But the Syrians were persistent, and they were getting better at their craft. The operational environment began to shift in late 1964, when Syrian counterintelligence arrested a separate Israeli spy network operating in Damascus, a network that had no connection to Cohen, but whose exposure heightened overall security paranoia. The arrested agents were tortured and executed, and the Syrian government publicized the case as proof of Israeli espionage efforts. The publicized arrests triggered an intensification of counterintelligence sweeps. The Mukhabarat increased surveillance in high-value neighborhoods, including al-Malki. They expanded the use of informants. They upgraded their signal intelligence capabilities with additional Soviet assistance. Cohen's handlers in Mossad assessed the changing threat environment and sent a coded message advising increased caution and reduced transmission frequency. Cohen complied, cutting his transmissions from 3 per week to 1 per week, and then to 1 every 10 days. The reduction in communication frequency was frustrating because he continued to gather high-value intelligence. But operational security had to take precedence. Despite the increased caution, the cumulative pattern of transmissions over 3 years had created a data trail. Syrian signal intelligence analysts, reviewing months of intercept logs, identified a recurring anomalous signal originating from the al-Malki district. The signal was brief, encrypted, and appeared at irregular intervals, but the general geographic origin was consistent. The analysts couldn't decrypt the signal, but they didn't need to. The mere existence of an unauthorized encrypted transmission from a high-security neighborhood was enough to warrant investigation. In early 1965, Syrian counterintelligence initiated a focused operation to identify the source of the transmissions. They deployed mobile direction-finding units in the al-Malki district, vehicles equipped with sensitive radio receivers and directional antennas that could pinpoint the origin of a transmission with increasing accuracy. The operation was covert. The vehicles were disguised as civilian utility trucks and civilian cars. The teams operated in shifts, monitoring the airwaves continuously. The challenge for the Syrians was that Cohen's transmissions were brief and unpredictable, which meant the direction-finding teams had to be in position and actively monitoring when a transmission occurred. This was a waiting game, a contest between Cohen's operational security and Syrian persistence. For several weeks, the teams detected nothing. Then, On a night in January 1965, Cohen transmitted a routine intelligence report. The transmission lasted 82 seconds. 3 Syrian direction-finding units were actively monitoring the designated frequency at that moment, positioned in different locations around the Al-Malki district. They all registered the signal. Analysts triangulated the data and determined that the transmission originated from a specific block of apartment buildings in the Al-Malki district. The search area had been narrowed from an entire neighborhood to a few hundred meters. The Syrian operation shifted from passive monitoring to active surveillance. Counterintelligence officers identified the buildings in the target area and began compiling lists of residents. They cross-referenced residents against intelligence databases, looking for individuals with questionable backgrounds, foreign connections, or unexplained wealth. Kemal Amin Taabes appeared on the list. He was a wealthy returning immigrant with Argentine connections, a profile that fit the parameters of a potential foreign agent. The Mukhabarat began discreet inquiries, checking his background story, verifying his business activities, and conducting surveillance of his movements and social contacts. Cohen was unaware that he was under active investigation, although his operational training had instilled a baseline level of paranoia that kept him alert for signs of surveillance. He continued his normal routine, attending social functions, hosting gatherings, maintaining business contacts, and making occasional trips outside Damascus. He reduced his transmission frequency further, to once every 2 weeks, and he varied his transmission locations within his apartment, using a portable setup that he could move to different rooms. On February 24, 1965, Cohen was scheduled to transmit a high-priority intelligence report containing details about Soviet military advisors working with the Syrian army. Mossad headquarters had specifically requested this information, and Cohen had spent 2 weeks collecting it through conversations with his military contacts. The transmission was scheduled for 2:30 a.m. Cohen prepared the radio, encoded the message using his one-time pad, and set up the portable antenna near a window that faced away from the street. He powered up the transmitter at exactly 2:30 a.m. and began the transmission. 30 seconds into the broadcast, Syrian direction-finding units positioned within 200 meters of his building registered the signal. The teams immediately began refining the triangulation. One unit reported the signal was coming from the block of buildings that included Cohen's apartment. A second unit confirmed. A third unit, positioned to the south, provided a cross-bearing that narrowed the location to a single building. The transmission ended after 90 seconds. Cohen powered down the radio, retracted the antenna, and disassembled the equipment, placing it back into the concealed compartment in the wooden chest. He felt a slight unease, a subtle intuition that something was wrong, but he had no concrete evidence. He looked out the window. The street below appeared normal, quiet, with a few parked cars and no unusual activity. He dismissed the feeling as routine operational stress and went to bed. The Syrian counterintelligence team convened an emergency meeting at 4 a.m. They reviewed the direction-finding data and concluded with high confidence that the illegal transmission originated from one of 12 apartments in a specific building in the Al-Malki district. Kemal Amin Taabes lived in one of those 12 apartments. The operational commander made the decision to place all 12 apartments under immediate physical surveillance and to accelerate background checks on the residents. By dawn, plainclothes surveillance teams were positioned around the building. They photographed everyone entering and exiting. They monitored visitors. Over the next 48 hours, they compiled detailed activity logs. Taabes was observed hosting a small dinner party, attended by 2 military officers and a businessman. He was observed leaving his apartment to visit a bank and a cafe. His behavior appeared normal, consistent with his known profile. The background check on Tabes returned mixed signals. His Argentine business history checked out. Investigators contacted sources in Buenos Aires and confirmed that a Kamel Amin Tabes had lived there and operated a business. However, deeper inquiry revealed some inconsistencies. Financial records showed transactions that were difficult to trace. Some of his claimed business associates in Argentina could not be located. The inconsistencies were not conclusive proof of espionage, but they were enough to elevate suspicion. The counterintelligence commander decided on a more aggressive approach. A covert entry into Tabes' apartment while he was out, to search for evidence of espionage equipment. On the afternoon of February 27, 1965, Cohen left his apartment to attend a business meeting across the city, a meeting that was legitimate and part of his ongoing cover activities. Syrian counterintelligence had been monitoring his schedule and knew he would be absent for at least 2 hours. A technical team, specialists in covert entry and search operations, entered his apartment using lockpicking tools. They moved quickly and methodically, searching for hidden compartments, false walls, and concealed equipment. They examined furniture, checked behind wall panels, and inspected electrical outlets. The search was professional. Items were photographed in their original positions so they could be replaced exactly, minimizing the chance that the target would notice the intrusion. After 40 minutes of searching, a technician discovered the false bottom in the ornate wooden chest. He triggered the hidden latch and the compartment opened, revealing the radio transmitter, the encryption pads, the portable antenna, and a notebook containing coded notations. The evidence was undeniable. The team photographed everything in place, then carefully closed the compartment and restored the chest to its original appearance. They exited the apartment, leaving no visible trace of their presence. The evidence was delivered to the Mukhabarat headquarters within the hour. Analysts examined the radio and confirmed it was a sophisticated covert transmitter, far beyond the capability of a civilian to construct or acquire legally. The encryption pads were recognized as one-time pads, a hallmark of professional intelligence operations. The conclusion was definitive. Kamel Amin Tabes was a foreign intelligence agent, almost certainly Israeli, operating a deep-cover espionage mission. The decision was made at the highest levels of Syrian intelligence and government. Tabes would be arrested, interrogated, and the full extent of his network and intelligence collection would be extracted. The arrest was planned for the early morning of February 28, 1965, a timing chosen to maximize surprise and minimize the risk that Tabes might destroy evidence or attempt escape. At 3 a.m., a team of Mukhabarat officers, backed by military security personnel, surrounded Cohen's apartment building. A separate team moved into position in the hallway outside his apartment door. The operational commander gave the signal, and the team breached the door using a battering ram. Cohen was asleep in his bedroom. He woke to the sound of the door crashing open and armed men flooding into his apartment. He understood immediately what was happening. There was no opportunity to destroy the radio or the encryption materials. The team moved too quickly. Within seconds, he was physically restrained, hands bound behind his back. The apartment was flooded with light as the team conducted a comprehensive search. They retrieved the radio from the wooden chest, removed the encryption pads, seized the notebook, and confiscated documents, cameras, and any other materials that might constitute evidence. Cohen said nothing during the arrest. He was taken into custody, transported to a Mukhabarat detention facility, and placed in an interrogation cell. The interrogation began within hours. Syrian intelligence officers confronted him with the radio equipment and the encryption pads. They demanded to know his real identity, who he worked for, how long he had been operating, and what intelligence he had transmitted. Cohen initially attempted to maintain his cover, claiming the equipment was not his, that it must have been planted. The interrogators were experienced and unmoved by the denials. They applied psychological pressure, then physical coercion. The interrogation lasted for days, using techniques designed to break resistance: sleep deprivation, stress positions, beatings, and threats. Cohen's training had included resistance techniques, but long-term resistance to professional interrogation is extremely difficult, and Syrian interrogators were skilled and ruthless. After several days of interrogation, Cohen's resistance began to erode. The combination of physical pain, psychological exhaustion, and the undeniable evidence against him made maintaining the cover story impossible. He admitted his real identity: Eli Cohen, an Israeli intelligence officer operating under the cover of Kamil Amin Taabes. The admission was a turning point. The interrogation shifted from establishing his identity to extracting operational details. The Syrians wanted to know everything: his methods, his contacts, the intelligence he had transmitted, the structure of his support network, and the identities of other Israeli agents in Syria. Cohen provided some information, a calculated balance between appearing cooperative to reduce the severity of torture and protecting critical information that could endanger other operations or individuals. He confirmed he had transmitted intelligence about military deployments and fortifications. He acknowledged he had cultivated relationships with Syrian officials. He did not reveal the specific identities of his Mossad handlers or the full extent of the intelligence network's structure. The interrogators used various tactics to extract more information, including showing him transcripts of intercepted transmissions, confronting him with statements from witnesses who had seen him at social functions with military officers, and presenting evidence of his movements and activities over the previous 3 years. The interrogation process was documented in detailed reports, some of which were later declassified. The reports describe Cohen as intelligent, resilient, and strategic in how he managed the interrogation, providing enough information to appear cooperative while protecting the most sensitive operational details. The arrest of Eli Cohen created an immediate crisis within Mossad and the Israeli government. Mossad headquarters learned of the arrest through signal intelligence intercepts of Syrian government communications and through the sudden cessation of Cohen's scheduled transmissions. The initial hope was that Cohen had been forced to go dark temporarily due to a security scare. But within 48 hours, Israeli intelligence confirmed through multiple sources that he had been arrested and was in custody. The Israeli government faced a critical decision: whether to publicly acknowledge Cohen and attempt a diplomatic or covert rescue operation, or to deny any connection and protect the secrecy of the intelligence operation. The decision was complicated by the fact that Cohen's arrest exposed the extent to which Israel had penetrated the Syrian government, which would cause a massive internal purge within Syria and damage Israel's intelligence-gathering capabilities across the region. The Israeli government chose a middle path. They discreetly approached several foreign governments, including France and the United States, requesting them to intervene with Syria on humanitarian grounds, without publicly confirming Cohen's identity as an Israeli agent. France, which had diplomatic relations with Syria, made a quiet approach to the Syrian government, suggesting that clemency or prisoner exchange might be considered. The Syrian government, however, was in no mood for leniency. The exposure of an Israeli agent who had penetrated the highest levels of government and military was a humiliation that demanded a public response. The Syrian leadership decided to prosecute Cohen publicly, using a military tribunal to demonstrate their resolve and to deter future espionage attempts. The trial of Eli Cohen began in Damascus in May 1965 and was conducted as a military tribunal under Syrian law. The proceedings were not transparent or fair by international standards. The outcome was predetermined. The prosecution presented the evidence: the radio transmitter, the encryption pads, the coded notebooks, and testimony from witnesses who confirmed Cohen's activities and social connections. The most damaging evidence was the detailed intelligence reports that Syrian investigators had reconstructed based on Cohen's interrogation admissions and analysis of the intercepted transmissions. The prosecution argued that Cohen had committed espionage and treason, that he had gathered classified military intelligence, and that he had endangered Syrian national security. The defense, such as it was, had no credible counter-argument. Cohen was not a Syrian citizen, so the treason charge was legally questionable, but the espionage charge was irrefutable. The tribunal proceedings lasted several days. Cohen was given an opportunity to speak. He made a brief statement in which he acknowledged his actions, but framed them in the context of serving his country, Israel, and doing what he believed was necessary for his nation's survival. He expressed no remorse for the espionage, but he did ask for mercy for the sake of his family. The statement had no impact on the verdict. On May 8, 1965, the military tribunal found Eli Cohen guilty of espionage and sentenced him to death by hanging. The verdict was announced publicly, and the Syrian government made it clear that the sentence would be carried out. International appeals for clemency intensified. The Israeli government made formal requests through diplomatic channels. World leaders, including Pope Paul VI, appealed to the Syrian president Amin al-Hafiz, the man who had been Cohen's friend, to commute the sentence. Al-Hafiz, whether out of personal anger at the betrayal or political calculation, refused all appeals. The execution was scheduled for May 18, 1965. On the morning of May 18, 1965, Eli Cohen was transported from his detention cell to Al-Marjeh Square in central Damascus, a public square that had been chosen for the execution as a demonstration of state power. Thousands of spectators gathered, a mix of citizens, government officials, and journalists. The execution was designed to be a public spectacle, a warning to anyone who might consider espionage against Syria. Cohen was led to a gallows that had been erected in the square. He was composed, showing no visible signs of fear or panic, a demeanor that several witnesses later remarked upon. He was allowed a brief final statement. According to some accounts, he recited the Shema, a central Jewish prayer affirming his faith. The execution was carried out at approximately 3:30 a.m. Cohen was hanged, and his body was left suspended for several hours as a public display. Photographs of the execution were published in Syrian newspapers and disseminated internationally, a graphic illustration of the consequences of espionage. The execution of Eli Cohen marked the end of one of the most successful deep-cover intelligence operations in modern history, and it created a profound impact within both Israel and the broader intelligence community. The immediate aftermath of Cohen's execution saw a comprehensive purge within the Syrian government and military. Syrian counterintelligence launched an internal investigation to identify everyone who had associated with Cohen, assess the extent of the intelligence compromise, and determine whether other Israeli agents remained operational. Dozens of military officers and government officials who had been friends or contacts of Cohen were interrogated. Some were dismissed from their positions. Some were arrested on suspicion of collaboration, although no evidence of deliberate collaboration was ever proven. Cohen had operated through social manipulation and deception, not through recruiting traitors. The purge created paranoia and distrust within the Syrian leadership, damaging internal cohesion at a critical time. The intelligence that Cohen had gathered and transmitted to Israel remained in Israeli hands, and it continued to have strategic value. The detailed maps and descriptions of the Golan Heights fortifications were integrated into Israeli Defense Forces planning documents. When the Six-Day War erupted in June 1967, just 2 years after Cohen's execution, Israeli forces used the intelligence Cohen had provided to conduct precise operations against Syrian positions. The fortifications that Cohen had personally toured and mapped were targeted with artillery and airstrikes based on coordinates he had transmitted. Israeli forces captured the Golan Heights in less than 3 days, a military success that was attributed in part to superior intelligence. And within the IDF, there was recognition that Eli Cohen's work had contributed to that success and had saved Israeli lives. The legacy of the Eli Cohen operation extends beyond the immediate tactical intelligence he provided. It became a case study within Mossad and other intelligence agencies on the principles of deep cover operations, social engineering, and the psychological demands of long-term espionage. Mossad operational doctrine incorporated lessons from the Cohen case. The importance of creating verifiable legends, the value of patient relationship building over aggressive intelligence collection, the critical role of cultural authenticity in penetration operations, and the risks of radio communications in hostile counterintelligence environments. The operation also highlighted the ethical and psychological costs of deep cover work. Cohen lived a lie for 3 years, isolated from his real identity, his family, and his support network, operating under constant threat of exposure and death. The psychological burden of that existence is difficult to quantify, but it is real, and it became a factor in how Mossad managed future deep cover operations, including attempts to provide better support mechanisms for agents in the field. The fact that Cohen was ultimately captured and executed also prompted a reassessment of operational security protocols, particularly around radio communications. Technical officers worked on developing more secure communication methods, including burst transmission technologies, satellite communications, and alternative covert channels that reduced reliance on radio transmitters, which were inherently vulnerable to direction finding. In the decades following his execution, Eli Cohen became a legendary figure in Israeli culture and history. His story was told in books, films, and television series, transforming him from an intelligence operative into a national hero. The Israeli government made multiple attempts to retrieve his body from Syria for burial in Israel, but the Syrian government consistently refused, using the body as a point of political leverage. Cohen's widow, Nadia, became a public advocate for her husband's legacy, giving interviews, writing memoirs, and campaigning for the return of his remains. She lived the rest of her life in Israel, raising their children and never remarried, maintaining her identity as the wife of Eli Cohen. The Israeli intelligence community honors Cohen's memory through various means, including naming training facilities and awards after him. Within Mossad, the Cohen operation is studied as a model of effective, deep cover intelligence work, and new case officers are taught the operational techniques and strategic principles that made the operation successful. The emotional and moral dimensions of the operation are also part of the training curriculum, ensuring that future operatives understand the costs and the sacrifices involved in deep cover work. The strategic impact of Cohen's intelligence work can be measured in multiple dimensions. At the tactical level, the detailed information he provided about Syrian military deployments, fortifications, and strategic planning gave Israeli military and political leaders a level of situational awareness that would have been impossible to achieve through signals intelligence or satellite reconnaissance alone, which were the primary alternative collection methods in the 1960s. At the operational level, Cohen's intelligence informed Israeli strategic planning for the defense of the northern border and the preparation for potential conflict with Syria, planning that proved critical during the Six-Day War. At the strategic level, the Cohen operation demonstrated to Israel's adversaries that Israeli intelligence capabilities were sophisticated, patient, and capable of penetrating even the most secure environments. A demonstration that had a deterrent effect and forced adversary intelligence services to divert resources into counterintelligence and internal security. The operation also demonstrated the value of human intelligence, or HUMINT, in an era when technological intelligence methods were beginning to dominate. While signals intelligence and imagery intelligence were becoming more advanced, the Cohen case showed that a single well-placed human source could provide context, intentions, and nuanced understanding that technical systems could not replicate. Within the broader history of espionage, the Eli Cohen operation occupies a significant place alongside other legendary deep-cover operations such as the Soviet agent Richard Sorge in Japan during World War II. The Cambridge Five, who penetrated British intelligence for the Soviet Union, and Oleg Penkovsky, the Soviet military intelligence officer who spied for the West during the Cold War. What distinguishes the Cohen operation is the depth of social penetration he achieved, the length of time he sustained the cover, and the direct tactical impact of the intelligence he collected. Unlike agents who held official positions within government or military structures, Cohen had no formal role. His access was entirely based on social relationships, trust, and personal charisma. This made his operation both more vulnerable, because he had no institutional protection, and more remarkable, because he achieved high-level access through pure social engineering. The operation also illustrates the fundamental tension in espionage between the need for security and the need for intelligence collection. Every transmission Cohen made, every meeting he attended, every relationship he cultivated, increased the risk of exposure. Mossad's handlers managed this tension by imposing communication discipline, limiting transmission frequency, and carefully calibrating the operational tempo. Despite these precautions, the cumulative risk eventually led to his exposure, a reminder that even the most sophisticated operations carry inherent dangers that cannot be entirely eliminated. The technical aspects of Cohen's communication methods reflect the state of covert communications technology in the early 1960s, a period before satellite communications, secure internet protocols, and advanced encryption algorithms. Cohen's radio transmitter was based on vacuum tube technology, which was reliable but bulky compared to modern solid-state electronics. The transmitter operated on shortwave frequencies, which could propagate over long distances but were also susceptible to interception and direction finding. The encryption system was based on one-time pads, a theoretically unbreakable encryption method if the pads are truly random, never reused, and kept secure. The one-time pad system requires that both the sender and the receiver have identical copies of a random key, which is used once and then destroyed. This system is secure but logistically challenging because it requires physical distribution of the pads, and if the pads are lost or compromised, the entire communication system is broken. Cohen received his one-time pads from Mossad during in-person meetings in Europe, and he was trained to destroy used pads immediately after encryption or decryption. The discovery of the pads during his arrest was a significant operational failure because it confirmed not only that he was an agent, but also that he was part of a sophisticated intelligence organization, which narrowed the list of possible sponsors to a very small number of nation-states, with Israel being the most obvious candidate given the geopolitical context. The psychological profile of Eli Cohen, as reconstructed from interviews with people who knew him, training records, and his actions during the operation, reveals a complex individual driven by a combination of ideological commitment, personal ambition, and a sense of duty. Cohen was a committed Zionist who believed deeply in the mission of protecting Israel, and this ideological foundation provided the moral justification for the deceptions and risks he undertook. He was also ambitious and sought to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was capable of extraordinary achievements. The intelligence work gave him a sense of purpose and significance that his previous life as an accountant had not provided. At the same time, Cohen was not reckless. His operational decisions were generally cautious and calculated. He followed his training, adhered to security protocols, and resisted the temptation to take unnecessary risks for the sake of gathering more intelligence. The fact that he sustained the operation for 3 years without significant errors is evidence of his discipline and competence. However, he was also human, subject to the same psychological pressures and emotional needs as anyone else. The isolation of deep cover work, the constant need to maintain a false identity, and the absence of normal social and emotional support took a toll. During his brief meetings with Mossad handlers in Europe, he expressed the strain he felt, the difficulty of living a lie, and the longing to return to his real life and his family. These expressions were not complaints. They were factual reports of his psychological state, information that his handlers needed to assess whether he could continue the operation safely. The ethical dimensions of the Cohen operation, and of espionage in general, are complex and subject to debate. From the Israeli perspective, the operation was a necessary and justified action to protect national security in the face of existential threats. Syria was a hostile nation that had engaged in military conflict with Israel, that supported armed groups attacking Israeli territory, and that was actively planning military operations that could threaten Israeli civilians. Gathering intelligence about Syrian military capabilities and intentions was a legitimate act of national defense. The fact that Cohen used deception and cultivated personal relationships under false pretenses raises moral questions. But these are questions that apply to all espionage activities, which inherently involve deception. From the Syrian perspective, Cohen was a spy who violated their sovereignty, betrayed the trust of individuals who considered him a friend, and endangered national security. And the execution was a lawful response under Syrian law and a necessary deterrent. The broader ethical question is whether the ends justify the means, whether the intelligence gathered and the lives potentially saved justify the deception, the risk, and the ultimate sacrifice of Cohen's life. There is no universally accepted answer to this question. It depends on one's moral framework, one's perspective on national security, and one's assessment of the specific circumstances. What is clear is that Cohen himself believed the mission was justified, that he accepted the risks knowingly, and that he conducted the operation according to the principles and values of the organization he served. The operational planning that preceded Cohen's deployment reflects Mossad's sophisticated understanding of penetration operations and the importance of creating a sustainable cover identity. The decision to build a legend based in Argentina, to spend months establishing that legend before entering Syria, and to create verifiable documentation and social connections was not improvised. It was based on intelligence doctrine that had been developed over years of operational experience. The choice of Argentina was strategic. It was a country with a significant Syrian expatriate community. It was geographically distant from the Middle East, which reduced the likelihood of direct verification. And it was a location where Mossad could operate with relative freedom to create the necessary infrastructure for the legend. The time invested in preparation, 14 months of training and legend building before Cohen ever set foot in Syria, was a recognition that shortcuts would lead to failure. Previous operations had failed because agents were inserted too quickly. with insufficiently developed covers, and Syrian counterintelligence had detected the anomalies. The Cohen operation avoided this mistake by investing in a cover that was deep, verifiable, and culturally authentic. The success of the cover allowed Cohen to pass initial scrutiny and to build the social network that became the foundation of his intelligence access. The social dynamics that Cohen exploited to gain access to Syrian officials and military officers are rooted in cultural codes that govern Middle Eastern society, particularly around hospitality, friendship, and trust. In many Middle Eastern cultures, social relationships are governed by norms of reciprocity and loyalty. Hospitality is not merely a social nicety. It is a moral obligation and a means of building social bonds. When Cohen hosted gatherings, served expensive food and drink, and treated his guests with generosity and respect, he was engaging in culturally significant behavior that created bonds of obligation and friendship. Guests who were treated well felt a reciprocal obligation to treat Cohen well, to include him in their social circles, and to share information with him. This is not unique to Middle Eastern culture. Similar dynamics exist in many societies, but the specific forms and intensity of these norms vary. Cohen understood these cultural codes because of his Syrian heritage, and he exploited them systematically and effectively. The fact that senior officials, including the future president of Syria, became his friends and trusted him with sensitive information is a testament to how powerful these social dynamics can be, and how vulnerable institutions can be to social engineering attacks that exploit cultural norms and personal relationships. The counterintelligence operation that led to Cohen's capture demonstrates the importance of persistence, technological capability, and systematic methodology in counter-espionage work. The Syrian Mukhabarat did not stumble upon Cohen by accident. They identified him through a methodical process that combined signal intelligence, direction-finding technology, and old-fashioned investigative work. The fact that it took them nearly 3 years to identify and capture Cohen is an indication of how effective his operational security was. But it is also a reminder that no operation is perfectly secure indefinitely. Every transmission, every meeting, every action creates data, and over time that data accumulates into patterns that can be analyzed and exploited. Syrian counterintelligence collected data on radio signals, analyzed patterns, narrowed the search area using direction finding, identified suspects through database checks and surveillance, and then confirmed their suspicions through covert search. This is a textbook counterintelligence operation, executed with competence and patience. The lesson for intelligence agencies is that operational security is not a static condition. It is a dynamic contest between the operational security measures of the agent and the investigative capabilities of the adversary. And in a long-term operation, the adversary's capabilities and knowledge are constantly increasing. The impact of Cohen's execution on his family, particularly his wife Nadia and their children, adds a human dimension to the story that is often overshadowed by the strategic and operational analysis. Nadia Cohen was left to raise their children alone, carrying the burden of being the widow of a convicted spy and a national hero, identities that were simultaneously sources of pride and pain. She spent decades advocating for the return of her husband's remains, meeting with Israeli politicians, appealing to international organizations, and making public statements to keep the issue alive. The Israeli government supported her efforts, making diplomatic approaches to Syria whenever opportunities arose. But the Syrian government consistently refused, viewing the body as a lever of political influence. For Nadia and her children, the refusal to return the body was a continuing source of grief, preventing closure and prolonging the emotional toll of the operation. Their experience highlights the personal costs of intelligence work, costs that extend beyond the individual agent to their families and loved ones, who must live with the consequences of decisions they did not make and operations they were not part of. The strategic relationship between Israel and Syria in the years following Cohen's execution and leading up to the Six-Day War was shaped by the intelligence Cohen had provided and by the broader regional dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Syria remained a frontline state in the conflict, hosting Palestinian militant groups, engaging in border skirmishes with Israel, and coordinating military planning with other Arab states, particularly Egypt. The Israeli military's capture of the Golan Heights in 1967 fundamentally changed the strategic balance, removing the high ground advantage that Syria had held and creating a buffer zone that improved Israel's defensive posture. The ease with which Israeli forces captured the Golan, completing the operation in less than 72 hours, surprised many military analysts and was attributed to a combination of factors: superior Israeli training and tactics, effective use of air power, and critically detailed intelligence about Syrian fortifications and troop deployments. While it is impossible to quantify precisely how much of the success was due to Cohen's intelligence versus other factors, Israeli military historians and former IDF officers have stated publicly that the intelligence was a significant contributing factor and that the operation would have been more difficult and would have resulted in higher casualties without it. The Mossad as an institution evolved in the years following the Cohen operation, incorporating lessons learned and adapting to new technological and geopolitical realities. The experience of losing Cohen, a highly successful agent who was captured due to technical surveillance limitations, prompted investment in more secure communication technologies and alternative intelligence collection methods. The development of satellite communication systems, which allowed for more secure and harder-to-intercept communications, became a priority. The use of dead drops, human couriers, and other non-technical communication methods was re-emphasized for situations where radio communications were too risky. Mossad also invested more heavily in technical intelligence capabilities, including signals intelligence and cyber operations, to complement human intelligence and reduce dependence on individual agents operating in high-risk environments. At the same time, the Cohen operation reinforced the enduring value of human intelligence and the irreplaceable insights that a well-placed human source can provide. No amount of technical surveillance could have provided the kind of contextual understanding, intentional analysis, and personal insights that Cohen delivered. The lesson was not to abandon human in favor of technical intelligence, but to integrate the two more effectively and to manage the risks of human operations more carefully. The cultural memory of Eli Cohen within Israel has been shaped by multiple narratives. The heroic spy who sacrificed his life for his country, the victim of a brutal execution by an enemy state, and the symbol of the lengths to which Israel must go to protect itself in a hostile region. These narratives serve different purposes. The heroic narrative provides a model of patriotic service and self-sacrifice that reinforces national identity and cohesion. The victim narrative serves as a reminder of the threats Israel faces and the costs of those threats. The symbolic narrative situates Cohen within the broader story of Israeli resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. All of these narratives are based on factual events, but they emphasize different aspects of the story and serve different cultural and political functions. The complexity of Cohen's actual experience, the moral ambiguities of espionage, and the personal costs to him and his family are sometimes simplified or overshadowed by the heroic framing, which is a common phenomenon in how societies remember and honor individuals who serve in national security roles. The Syrian government's handling of the Cohen case, from the investigation through the trial and execution, was driven by a combination of legal, political, and strategic considerations. Legally, Cohen had committed espionage under Syrian law, and the death penalty was a standard punishment for such offenses, particularly in the context of a military tribunal during a period of heightened security concerns. Politically, the public trial and execution served to demonstrate the government's competence in protecting national security, to deter future espionage attempts, and to rally public support around the government by portraying it as defending the nation against foreign threats. Strategically, the execution sent a message to Israel and to other adversaries that Syria would respond harshly to intelligence operations, a message intended to increase the perceived cost and risk of such operations. The refusal to return Cohen's body, even decades after the execution, reflects a calculation that maintaining control of the body provides ongoing political leverage and serves as a continuing reminder of the espionage incident. From a Syrian perspective, the Cohen case is remembered as a successful counterintelligence operation that exposed and neutralized a significant Israeli intelligence penetration, and the execution is viewed as a justified legal and security response. The technical analysis of Cohen's radio transmitter and communication methods, conducted by both Syrian intelligence after his capture and by intelligence historians in subsequent years, reveals the capabilities and limitations of covert communication technology in the 1960s. The transmitter Cohen used was a custom-built device designed by Mossad technical officers specifically for covert operations. It was more sophisticated than commercial radio equipment available at the time, incorporating features such as frequency agility, which allowed the operator to change frequencies quickly to avoid detection, and burst transmission capability, which compressed messages into short, high-speed transmissions to minimize the window during which direction-finding equipment could lock onto the signal. However, the underlying technology was still based on radio frequency transmission, which is inherently detectable if the adversary has the right equipment and the patience to search for it. The encryption system, based on one-time pads, was theoretically secure, meaning that without the physical pad, the encrypted message could not be decrypted. However, the physical security of the pads was a vulnerability. If the pads were captured, as they were when Cohen was arrested, the security of the system was compromised, and analysts could potentially decrypt previous messages if they had intercepted and recorded them. Modern covert communication systems have moved beyond radio frequency transmissions to methods such as internet-based communication using encryption protocols like PGP or AES, satellite phones, and steganography, which hides messages within innocent-looking digital files. These modern methods are more secure and harder to detect than the radio transmitters of the 1960s, but they are not invulnerable, and the fundamental contest between operational security and counterintelligence detection continues. The geopolitical context of the early 1960s, during which Cohen operated, was characterized by intense regional conflict. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union playing out in the Middle East, and the relatively recent establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which had led to multiple wars and ongoing tensions with neighboring Arab states. Syria was aligned with the Soviet Union, receiving military equipment, training, and intelligence support from Soviet advisors. Israel was aligned with the West, receiving support from the United States and European countries. The regional conflict was not merely a local dispute, it was embedded within the global Cold War struggle, with both superpowers using Middle Eastern states as proxies to advance their strategic interests. In this context, intelligence operations like the Cohen mission were not isolated events. They were part of a broader pattern of espionage, covert operations, and proxy conflicts that characterized the era. The Soviet Union was conducting its own intelligence operations in the region, both to support its allies and to gather intelligence on Western activities. The CIA and other Western intelligence services were similarly active. The Middle East was a hotbed of espionage activity, and the Cohen operation was one of many intelligence contests playing out simultaneously, though it was among the most successful from an Israeli perspective. The investigative journalism and historical research that has been conducted on the Cohen operation in the decades since his execution has revealed details that were not publicly known at the time, and has corrected some of the myths and misconceptions that developed in popular accounts. Declassified Israeli government documents, interviews with former Mossad officers who were involved in the operation, and Syrian government records that have become accessible have provided a more complete and accurate picture of how the operation was planned, executed, and ultimately compromised. Some of the early popular accounts romanticized Cohen's role, portraying him as a lone wolf operator who single-handedly penetrated the Syrian government through sheer charisma and daring. The reality, revealed through historical research, is that Cohen was part of a sophisticated, well-planned operation that involved extensive preparation, significant Mossad resources, careful handling by experienced case officers, and a calculated strategy that balanced intelligence collection with operational security. Cohen was indeed charismatic and competent, but his success was also the result of institutional support, professional training, and operational planning. Similarly, some accounts portrayed the Syrian counterintelligence service as incompetent for taking 3 years to detect Cohen. Historical analysis shows that Syrian counterintelligence was actually quite effective, using sophisticated technical methods and persistent investigative work to identify and capture Cohen, and that the 3-year duration of the operation before capture is actually a testament to the strength of Cohen's cover and operational security, not to Syrian incompetence. The final transmission that Cohen attempted on the night he was under active surveillance, the transmission that led directly to the pinpointing of his location and his subsequent arrest, contained intelligence about Soviet military advisors in Syria, information that Mossad headquarters had specifically requested as a high priority. The presence of Soviet military advisors was a significant concern for Israeli strategic planners because it indicated a deepening of Soviet-Syrian military cooperation and raised the possibility that Soviet personnel might become directly involved in future conflicts. The intelligence Cohen was transmitting included the numbers of Soviet advisors, their locations, the units they were assigned to, and the types of training and support they were providing. This was precisely the kind of strategic intelligence that justified the risks of the operation. And it was intelligence that could not have been obtained through technical means alone. The irony is that this high-value intelligence transmission was also the transmission that sealed Cohen's fate, because it occurred at a time when Syrian direction-finding units were actively positioned and monitoring, and the signal was detected and triangulated with sufficient precision to identify his building. The operational decision to proceed with the transmission, despite the increased counterintelligence activity that Mossad analysts had observed, was a calculated risk that ultimately proved fatal to the operation. The interrogation techniques used by Syrian intelligence to extract information from Cohen after his arrest were consistent with interrogation practices used by many intelligence and security services in that era. Practices that are now widely recognized as torture and are prohibited under international law. The techniques included physical beatings, stress positions designed to cause pain without leaving permanent visible injury, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, including threats against family members, and prolonged isolation. The purpose of these techniques is to break the subject's will to resist and to create a psychological state where providing information seems like the only way to stop the pain and suffering. Cohen resisted for several days before beginning to provide information, a duration that is consistent with the expected resistance capacity of trained intelligence officers under interrogation. The information he provided was selective and strategic. He confirmed facts that the interrogators already knew or could easily verify, such as his true identity and the fact that he was working for Israeli intelligence, while withholding information that could endanger other operations or individuals, such as the specific identities of his handlers and the full structure of Mossad's operational networks. Professional interrogators are trained to detect when subjects are withholding information and to apply additional pressure. But there are limits to what even the most coercive interrogation can extract, particularly from a subject who is trained, intelligent, and motivated to resist. The Syrian interrogation of Cohen was ultimately successful in obtaining enough information to confirm the espionage charges and to understand the general scope of his intelligence collection. But it did not result in the capture of other Israeli agents or the complete dismantling of Mossad's operations in the region, which suggests that Cohen successfully protected some critical information despite the interrogation. The legacy of the Eli Cohen operation within the professional intelligence community extends beyond Mossad and Israeli intelligence services. It has been studied by intelligence agencies around the world as a case study in deep cover operations, social engineering, and the management of long-term human intelligence assets. The operation is taught in intelligence training programs as an example of how to build and maintain a sustainable cover identity, how to cultivate access through social relationships rather than through institutional positions, and how to balance the imperative to collect intelligence with the need to maintain operational security. It is also taught as a cautionary example of the inherent risks of radio communications in hostile counterintelligence environments, and the importance of having alternative communication methods and contingency plans. The personal story of Cohen, his commitment, his sacrifice, and the impact on his family is used in some training programs to illustrate the human costs of intelligence work and the ethical responsibilities that intelligence agencies have to their agents and to the families of agents who are lost in the line of duty. The fact that Cohen's story is widely known through books, films, and television has made it accessible to a broader public audience, which is relatively unusual for intelligence operations, most of which remain classified and unknown outside of professional intelligence circles.